Boa tarde a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos a essa sessão de debates organizada pelo. Sejam muito bem-vindos a mais esse debate organizado pelo Fórum sobre Genocídios e Crimes contra a Humanidade da Universidade de São Paulo, coordenado, então, por professor Paulo Casella, eh, professor Arthur Giannatasio, Felipe Alamino e por mim mesma, representando as humanidades, a Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas. Nosso convidado hoje é Neve Gordon, que é professor de Direito Internacional e Direitos Humanos da Queen Mary University de Londres, em que é israelense, nascido em Israel, pesquisa e escreve sobre temas relacionados ao conflito israelo-palestino, as questões que dizem respeito a Israel, ao colonialismo e aos direitos humanos nesse país. Tem vários livros publicados, entre eles O Direito Humano de Dominar, estou fazendo uma tradução livre do título, também Escudos Humanos, é outro nome de outro livro dele, também em tradução livre minha, e que publicou na Folha de São Paulo, esse domingo, na Folha Ilustríssima, um artigo sobre a fome como arma de guerra, mostrando o histórico da utilização da fome como arma para repressão e guerra contra os palestinos, especificamente na faixa de Gaza, desde décadas atrás, não como algo exclusivo desse conflito. Então, é um grande prazer receber o professor Neve Gordon e eu vou passar para o inglês para poder dar as boas-vindas e passar a palavra para ele. So, Professor Neve, it's great to have you here. It's a great honor. It's a great pleasure to be able to have your participation, to listen to your speech. I was just forgetting to say that you are also, ele também é presidente ainda em exercício do British Societies for Middle East Studies, a BRISMES. E, bom, with you, Professor Neve, please.
So thank you, Arlene, for inviting me, and thanks the forum for inviting me. Although I'm not in Brazil now, it's actually the first talk I've ever given in Brazil. And it's a great honor for me to be here and to speak with all of you. And we are in a very difficult moment at this time. We're in a difficult moment because over 34,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, 2/3 of them women and children. The Gaza Strip, large parts of it have been turned into rubble. We are all aware that all the universities in there have been damaged. Two-thirds of the schools in the Gaza Strip have been bombed and damaged. And 1/3 of these schools will not be functionable even after the fighting is completed, meaning that 1/3 of the 625,000 children will not be able to get back to school after the fighting ends. The International Court of Justice has claimed that what is taking place in the Gaza Strip is plausibly a genocide. All evidence on the ground suggests that it is a genocide, while the utterances of the Israeli leadership, both the political leadership and the military leadership, reveals an intention to carry out genocide. This is a unique moment also in the sense that what we're seeing, at least in North America and in Europe, is that there's a wide gap between civil society that is supporting the Palestinian cause and protesting daily to stop the violence, to institute a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, while the political elites in the United States, in the UK, where I'm speaking from, and in Europe have not been convinced and have not called have not demanded from Israel to institute a ceasefire. Within this situation of what many genocide, most I think genocide experts say is a genocide unfolding, and massive civil society uproar against this genocide, we also see a clampdown on those that are protesting this horrific violence. And the clampdown is being carried out in the United States, in the UK, across Europe, by accusing those that fight for Palestinian rights as if they're anti-Semites. Now, this might sound unclear, given that those that are critical of what is going on are criticizing the Israeli government and its policies, while when we think of anti-Semitism, it's hatred towards Jews. Now, the reason why they can use anti-Semitism in order to silence those that are critical of the Israeli government is that in the past 4 or 5 years, a new definition of more 8 years, in the past 8 years, a new definition of anti-Semitism has appeared on the world stage. And this definition of anti-Semitism includes the traditional anti-Semitism of conspiracy theories against the Jews, the claim that the Jews control the banks and they control the media, and different nefarious characters of the Jews and the Holocaust denial. All what we know as traditional anti-Semitism, it includes that, but it also adds to that a conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and harsh criticism of Israel. Now, it would seem, how is it that anti-Semitism becomes associated with criticism of government action and a political ideology, which is Zionism? Zionism, I'm not a Zionist, I'm a Jew. And so if you criticize Zionism, I don't feel that you criticize me. So how is it that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have been conflated? And it's a dangerous moment because, as I said, 45 governments have adopted this definition across the globe. In the UK, 75% of universities have adopted it. Many civil society organizations in the United States, I think about 30 states have adopted it. Again, numerous municipalities and so forth. So how is it that a definition of anti-Semitism is expanded to include criticism of state policies, and that so many have accepted it? And I claim that the definition itself does some very important work that helps us explain this phenomenon. And I'm talking about 3 different operations of definition. One is that the definition itself creates an affective bond, an emotional bond between the individual Jew and between the state. 2 is that it identifies the right to difference with the right to the state. And 3, that it produces a notion of democratic apartheid. And what I'd like to do is discuss in about 10, 15 minutes all 3 of them, and then show how it is shielding basically crimes against humanity and today even genocide. And then maybe we'll open up to conversation with Arlene and the rest of the members from the forum. So first, the idea that basically criticism of Israel and criticism of Zionism is anti-Semitic is not completely new idea. It was an idea that began to circulate in the early 1970s. And in 1975, when the UN adopted the notion that Zionism is racism, the former foreign minister of Israel, Abba Eban, came out with an op-ed in the New York Times and claimed that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are the same. But this idea did not gain much credence until the beginning of the new millennium with the war on terror, the Durban Conference of NGOs that basically tried to reassert the idea that Zionism is racism and Israel's a secular colonial state, and a variety of other issues. This idea has now become the orthodox. Now, the way it works was instituted by different people, but basically there is a conflation between the individual Jew, and the individual Jew belongs to the collective Jew. And since Israel identifies itself as the Jewish state, the collective Jew is identified with Israel, and therefore criticism of the individual Jew becomes criticism of the state. And the definition itself, and particularly not the definition, but it is connected to 11 illustrative examples, 7 of which discuss Israel, creates this effective bond. So one of the illustrative examples says that if you say that Israel's a racist endeavor, then you are an anti-Semite. Now, the Jew, often, not every Jew, but the definition produces a certain affective bond between the individual Jew and the state through the collective Jew. And so, for example, if I'm sitting in my classroom and teaching the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or teaching human rights, and I teach the Amnesty International report that claims that Israel's an apartheid state, or the Human Rights Watch report that claims that Israel's apartheid state, or the B'Tselem report, or the El-Haq report, there's several. I'm basically saying that Israel's a racist endeavor because it's an apartheid state. The individual Jew that sits in the class can feel that that claim is directed against them personally because they identify with Israel, because Israel has classified itself as the Jewish state and therefore as the representative of all Jews. And then the Jew sitting in the diaspora, whether it's in the UK or in Brazil, becomes offended when I utter the words, Israel's an apartheid state, because that defies the definition of the IHRA. So the definition itself and the whole propaganda machine creates a conflation that becomes an emotional conflation, and people actually feel it. It's not, they don't make it up when they say that they feel that their right has been violated when I say Israel is an apartheid regime. Now, in order for them to feel that, another move had to take place. And that has to do with the right to difference. The right to difference emerged actually, again, in the new French right. And the idea was that difference is important. Now, the idea came against a human rights perspective that often disavows difference and tries to think of the subject as universal. And so that something connects all of us as humans, and there's a certain kind of recognition of difference within human rights only to be disavowed. And that what connects us is this kind of universality. And the New French Right said that this universality erases difference, erases cultural difference, religious difference, traditions of different groups, and so forth. And that by erasing that, the universal human rights, in their view, becomes racist. Now, as anthropologists know, already in 1947, anthropologists, seeing that the Universal Declaration is going to be formulated, warned against a certain kind of universalization of the human subject and eraser of difference. But they didn't say that it produces racism, as the French New Right did. But even the French New Right didn't do what Israel and the IHRA definition is doing. What Israel and the IHRA is doing is that they're conflating this difference, which is difference of a culture, a minority group, a cultural group, Native Americans, indigenous Palestinians, different kinds of groups, minority groups in the state, they're connecting the right to difference with the state of Israel. And therefore, criticism of the state of Israel becomes criticism of a basic right, the basic right to difference. Okay? So that is the second move of the IHRA definition. And these first two moves are basically operate on the Jewish subjects that reads the IHRA definition. Most non-Jews will not feel an effective bond to the state of Israel. Most non-Jews will not think that Israel necessarily has a right to difference. They will think that Jews have a right to difference, but not Israel has a right to difference, okay, which is a very different thing. However, the definition does something else. It adds a third component that becomes appealing to much broader audiences. And that is that it presents Israel as a democracy. But Israel presents itself also as a democracy. Now, Israel is a democratic and Jewish state. A democratic and Jewish state, in my opinion, is an oxymoron. Because the basic notion of a Jewish state, of a democracy, is equality among all the citizens. And that the regular inhabitants of the land are also citizens. Now, many people in Israel considered a state for all its citizens, where all its citizens are equal, as the destruction of Israel. It is not the destruction of Israel. It is the destruction of Jewish supremacy in Israel, which is a very different thing. Now, why is this attractive to non-Jews? This is attractive to non-Jews because there are many, I don't know many, but there are several leaders and right-wing political parties that are very interested in this model where one group is allocated rights that other groups in the state are not allocated, other citizens in the state are not allocated these rights, and that this state will be called a democracy. So there's a move to change the basic principles of what we consider the democracy, sovereignty of the people, not by changing the notion of sovereignty of, but by changing the notion of the people, by saying that only some of the citizens are really the people. And that is attractive to leaders like Orban in Hungary. That is attractive to certain leaders in Poland. That is attractive to certain leaders in the Netherlands and in France and in the UK. Okay? And so they like the definition too, because the model the definition assumes through its illustrative examples is a model of the kind of political structure, political regime that they would like to institute in their country. A political regime that doesn't like migrants, a political regime that doesn't like citizens that are people of color. Now, this definition has become a major tool in the silencing of speech around Palestine. And we can see it in the places that I've been following recently, which is Israel, the UK, Germany, and the United States. This definition has been used to put people behind bars, to suspend people from universities, to fire people from universities. It has been used to cancel courses in universities. Anything and anyone who comes and claims, for example, that Israel is a settler colonial regime that, like other settler colonial regime, institutes a form of racial governance, is liable to be blamed of being anti-Semitic. Now, anti-Semitic is a harsh accusation. It's a hate crime. Hate crimes are serious crimes that we do need to take seriously. And I'm not, and anti-Semitism, the traditional anti-Semitism that I was talking about before, is alive and kicking. But no one's looking now at that anti-Semitism. They're looking at this made-up anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism that is basically a tool that is used to defend Israel against the crimes that it is currently committing against the Palestinians. And so it has become a silencing. It has become a very violent tool because through this tool, people are now being imprisoned. There's people, just to give an example of numbers, people understand what I'm talking about. So just in the university setting, there's a group called the European Legal Support Center that was created about 5 years ago to defend free speech on Palestine, and it works in 3 countries, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and in the UK. Over the past 5 years, until October 7th, it has received approximately 100 complaints a year from all 3 countries about efforts to silence free speech on Palestine. In the past half year, it has received only in the UK 250 complaints. So we're talking about dramatic increase in number. In Israel, 160 Palestinian students have been suspended. Some of them have been arrested for showing empathy. Many of them, it's just showing empathy with the Palestinians in the Gaza, supporting a struggle for decolonization can lead you to jail. And so this is a very serious moment, and it's very paradoxical in a sense, because we have a definition that assumes that Jewish sovereign state is the primary actor responsible for protecting Jews from forms of racial governments like the ones that existed in Germany and in East Europe until the mid-20th century. But the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism aims to protect Jewish sovereignty in the form of racial governance that Israel has established to subjugate and dispossess Palestinians. So the definition itself that has come out and emerged as a tool against racism has become a tool to defend racism. And that is extremely dangerous. So I think I've talked for about 20, 25 minutes. I'm going to stop now and let's have a conversation. You're on mute, Arlene.
There. Thank you very much, Neve, for that presentation. It has been very enlightening, very useful to understand how the IHRA definition of the new anti-Semitism operates, what kind of relations it creates, what kind of operations it puts in motion. So I'd like to bring this a bit to Brazil, and then of course, hopefully, we can also manage to put questions from other people watching your speech. So here in Brazil, the whole IHRA thing, you know, the new definition narrative, the lobby over states to approve this definition, it only began last year. So until last year, we didn't have this here in Brazil. But then the last year, it came in, and before the 7th of October, we had the state of Rio de Janeiro approving the new definition, the state of São Paulo stating that through a decree of the governor, I don't even know if this, to what extent this can actually be put in practice, but saying that schools, public schools in São Paulo should adopt the new definition to teach the Holocaust. So that's what children should start to learn in schools. So it was very interesting to listen to how you explained that this definition is actually useful for non-democratic governments, because that's exactly what we have in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Right-wing, centrist right-wing, or even far right-wing, not only state governments, but configurations in town councils and so on. So they have we have begun to see this being adopted here. And then there's the dimension, you know, of public opinion. This has also reached public opinion with lots of pressure against academics, people, students. I mean, the University of São Paulo, we've had students since the beginning. And then this in public opinion really began with the 7th of October. That's when the whole thing really, you know, started in public opinion, you know. So the first thing I'd like to understand is inside academia in the UK, which you follow so closely, or in Europe in general, when did this start? And we already have an idea of how far this has gone, but when did this start? I'd also like to let you know that we do have one, possibly two, but at least one person undergoing a lawsuit, a law case for his publications and posts on the internet and so on that are not really traditional anti-Semitism, but are very much in line with like the criticism of Israeli policies, the criticism of Zionism, and this is being then conflated with anti-Semitism. And by the way, this person is Jewish, so it puts everything together here. So when would you say that this really started in academia and in public opinion in Europe and in the UK specifically? to begin with?
So in the UK, there's a very clear, often when something starts is unclear, and I don't think we can know exactly when something starts. But in the UK, at least, there is a moment that something happened. In October 2020, after I suspect quite a lot of lobbying, the Secretary of State for Education sent a letter to all university leaders, something like 150, 160 universities, saying if you do not adopt this definition by December, there will be financial repercussions. And so universities like Oxford and Cambridge that are wealthy can do whatever they want, and they didn't need to adopt it. But as I said before, 75%, including my own university, have adopted it. Just because of that one letter, and they adopted it, almost all these universities adopted it without any meaningful consultation, not asking the experts. Every university has genocide experts, has experts on hate speech, and so forth, not asking their experts whether to adopt it or not. And by far, the vast majority of experts would have told them no, so they didn't want to ask. In Germany is a very different story because of its history. Germany is like an outlier in a sense. And in the United States, it has been adopted incrementally, state by state, legislator by legislator, many things. But in the United States, there's slightly more protections than in the UK because of the First Amendment, the Amendment of Freedom of Speech, and you can also say a lot of things in the United States you cannot say in many other countries. But there's been this lobbying, I would say, from around 2016. Major efforts have been introduced. Jewish people go and speak with the leaders of their organizations, ask them to adopt. Now, what is happening here, which relates to the Brazilian case, is that there's in many respects discrimination against the Jews by those who adopt. Why? Because the Jews is not a homogeneous group. It's a group with many political opinions. Probably most of the Jews living abroad do not identify as Zionist, or half of them. In fact, in Israel itself, 20% of the citizens, I'm not talking of Palestinians that are not citizens, but 20% of the citizens are Palestinians. They're not Jews. So it doesn't take their views into account. It doesn't take the views of non-Zionist Jews into account. And basically discriminates us and tells us, you have to support this political ideology as a Jew. Okay? And that is very problematic. So the moment I think that you're looking for, it's probably around 8 years in the making. And in different countries, it has managed to be introduced in different periods. I think also for the pro-Israel lobby, the United States is probably the most important country to adopt it, and then the UK and France, and maybe the Netherlands and other. And then now they're heading towards Latin America, South America, and you guys are next in line.
Yeah, that's what we can that's what we see here. Also, since we're talking about the Jews here and their relation to this new definition, well, first thing, the new definition you were saying, it does introduce, I mean, it does include the traditional anti-Semitism. Now, when the IHRA lobbies and etc., do they seem to does this new definition actually, in your opinion, harm or make more difficult or leave aside the protection against the traditional anti-Semitism?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. So most of my life I lived in Israel and I never experienced anti-Semitism. In fact, I never experienced, I really, maybe once in my life, I've come across it. However, I moved to the UK in 2016. I have two children. One is still in school, the other one just finished school. And they experience traditional anti-Semitism in school. So anti-Semitism exists. I imagine it. I'm sure it exists in Brazil. I'm sure it exists in every country. And what has happened is that because the struggle from Israel's perspective is not against the traditional anti-Semitism, but using it as a kind of shield to allow Israel to do as it wants, which is the new anti-Semitism, almost all of the resources in tracking and in fighting anti-Semitism are directed to people that are not anti-Semites, but are people that believe that the Palestinians deserve liberation and deserve statehood and deserve their basic human rights. And so there's a deflection from what I consider as the real anti-Semitism into something that is a tool of statecraft to protect its policies. And that's a dangerous moment, particularly for Jews living in the diaspora, because it is the definition of anti-Semitism that protects them against hate crimes based on their own Jewish characteristic and not based on the political ideology of a state that they don't belong to. And that's a very important moment. Now we do need to recognize that what I'm not saying that someone can be both an anti-Semite and an anti-Zionist. It's not mutually exclusive. But I am saying that the fact that someone is not is an anti-Zionist does not mean they're an anti-Semite. And it's very different. And that point, so one can morph into the other, but being an anti-Zionist, and there's a lot of anti-Zionists out there right now because of what Israel's doing in Gaza, and the vast majority of them are not anti-Semite. I can tell you that the biggest protests probably against what's going on in Gaza have been taking place in London with hundreds of thousands of people going on weekends and marching. And I can tell you that I go to these protests and I go with my partner and I go with my child that's still at home and I speak Hebrew when I walk in those streets. And it's very clear that I'm not only a Jew, but Israeli, because I speak Hebrew to everyone walking around us. And I have never felt any danger, any sense of unsafety, and so forth. It is not about me being a Jew. It is about a political ideology that is now, in the name of that ideology, carrying out crimes against humanity and genocide in the Gaza.
That seems very clear to me. Thank you for that explanation. But still, a lot of the discussion here or the accusations that we hear here when someone, for example, criticizes Israeli apartheid and then says something like, okay, so from the river to the sea, we need the end of apartheid, this is immediately put as anti-Semitism because it would be a call to the end of the state of Israel. How could you argue around that? How could you explain that? And would you say that it is or is not anti-Semitism if someone in a demonstration calls for from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free or something like that?
The question is, what does the decolonization mean, I think? And that and the question is, what does from the river to this the Palestine will be free mean, right? That's the question. Now, there are many answers to this, and it is, of course, contextual. One could imagine that that means the elimination of Israeli Jews. And if one imagines that, then it is anti-Semitic. Um, but one does not have to imagine that, and that is not the feeling in the protest that I described. The feeling in the protest that I described is a feeling of cessation of violence, of justice, and of peace. And that is the context where it is claimed and uttered. And so, therefore, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or from the river to the sea, everyone will be free, can gesture to the notion that I mentioned before of state of all its citizens. And that state might not be called Israel, and it might be called Israel, but the basic idea behind it is that the inhabitants of the land will be free. And the inhabitants of the land, currently half of them, are not free. Now, last night, I don't know if you know, but last night was the evening of Passover. And there were 12 people around our table here in London, and we read the Agadah, which is the Jewish scriptures for Passover. And it is a holiday that celebrates the move from slavery to liberation. And it's a holiday that not even non-Jews know about it because of that, because that is a universal notion of morality, the move from slavery to liberation. Now, Palestine, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is something that I could easily say at the Passover dinner last night and say that I pray for this because I want all the inhabitants of the land from the river to the sea to be free. But that would necessarily mean the end of Jewish supremacy. And I don't want to belong to a country, to a state, where one group is the lord of the land and has supremacy over other groups. I am a Democrat in the original sense of equality, equality and freedom, the Rousseauian sense of it. So I think this is what the statement actually says in the protest I've gone to. And I think that the vast majority of the people that chant it are not genocidal and are not eliminationist. And to put on them this genocidal and eliminationist ideas is something that's in someone's head that's putting it on them. Because as I said, I go there and speak Hebrew when they're chanting it. And people come and speak to me and ask, where are you from? And I say, I'm from Israel. And it's fine. They don't want to eliminate me. So there's also a scare tactic. I have Israeli friends now who want to come and visit me in London. And they ask me, Neve, how's the anti-Semitism in London? We heard it's rampant. We heard you can't go around talking Hebrew. we heard blah, 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 blah. The same about France, the same about many countries. And it's a fiction. It's a fiction to make people fear. Now, I'm not saying there isn't anti-Semitism. I said before there is, but it's nothing that like you're afraid to walk anywhere and be yourself and speak your mother tongue like I do.
Right, thank you. I could continue asking. I'd just like to know if my colleagues here would like to put any questions before.
Well, if I may, uh, I guess there are some questions from the audience. Some of them Philippe has already forwarded to you. But dear Professor Neve Gordon, there is something which has been much discussed in Brazil, the initiative of South Africa to bring a case to the International Court of Justice on possible genocide and also apartheid committed by Israeli government against the Palestinian population in the area. And this is something which the fact that it was supported by Brazilian government resulted in the declaration of President Lula as persona non grata by Israel's foreign minister, Israel Katz. And this has been done in quite an hysterical and unpolite way, to put it frankly. And this is something which has been quite often repeated. If you are in line with South Africa, you are doing the game of Hamas. How do you, as an international law professor and much involved in these questions, see these ongoing claim brought by South Africa to the ICJ?
I read South Africa's submission to the ICJ. I also watched proceedings in the ICJ when it was discussed. I think it's an extremely solid application to the ICJ. And I think it was solid when it was submitted. I think the situation today is even much worse. And I think that if we look at the definition of genocide, the legal definition of genocide, which asks to demonstrate intent, and that is the most difficult part usually, and not the actual actions, I think they managed to demonstrate both very clearly and very powerfully. There's scores, if not hundreds, of quotes of Israeli leaders, and they show how leaders are calling to erase the Gaza Strip, how the president is saying there's no uninvolved civilian in the Gaza Strip, and how these messages trickle down from the very most powerful people, whether it's the Minister of Defense that calls the Palestinians human animals, and the president, and how they go down to the military commanders and then to the soldiers. And there's probably several hundred quotes there, or scores of quotes at least. And then you look at what's going on the ground and what's going on in the ground. And we have to remember and remind those that do not know the definition is not the Holocaust, putting 6 million people in gas chambers. The definition is about destroying in whole or in part a people, in whole or in part a people, and never in the history, I think, or hardly ever, was the whole ever totally achieved. It was almost. And it has to do with the destruction of culture. It has to do with a lot of things. So I would recommend it's very short. It's to read the definition and see. So there is genocide. Now, because it is such a strong case, it has touched a hard nerve. It has touched a nerve, and anyone that supports it is pushing that nerve and hurting. And so when Lula says that Brazil is supporting it, that hurts. And you would expect a harsh reaction. And so what is going on now, I think, is that any country that dares to support it is getting the wrath of Israel. But I think it is very important to those that fight genocide not to bow down and to say, not in our name, and we do not want it, and you have to stop it. So I think it's extremely important, the ethical stance that the Brazilian government has adopted in its support of the application to the ICJ. And I think because it is such a strong application, its support becomes a real threat. And because of that, you're seeing the kind of reactions.
Well, thank you, Neve. I have a question here. Felipe sent me, came through the chat by Carlos Perini. First he praises your presentation, your speech, excellent, and so forth. And then he says, well, considering the beginning of the Zionist movement as an intellectual movement in the 19th century, was it already possible to observe this symbiosis between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
I'm not sure I understand.
Or is it correct to say that this context resulted from the political interest of this movement by European powers? So maybe would it be correct to say that there is a symbiosis between anti-Semitism and Zionism in the 19th century in any sense? Maybe quite the opposite.
I think the way I understand is, particularly after World War II, there was a struggle on how to deal with anti-Semitism. On the one hand, there were the Zionists that were saying that the only way to protect Jews was through the creation of the nation state. And there's a powerful claim to that. We need to understand that this claim does not, it does merit conversation and merits power. Why? And here I refer to the great Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, which looks at the refugee crisis following the First World War, has this very interesting observation, and it's from her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the chapter called The Perplexity of Human Rights. And she basically says something very interesting. She says, when a person loses social belonging, and particularly belonging to the state, when they become a refugee, as we say, when they lose this kind of belonging, and all that remains is their humanness, that is when they lose all rights. That is when they don't have any rights. Okay? And she says that the protector of rights is the nation state. Now, we know also that the major abuser of rights is the nation state. There is a paradox that the protector and the abuser are the same entity. Okay? And her claim was based, but is a bit different than Edmund Burke's claim when he's writing about the French Revolution. And he's writing about the French Revolution, and he's criticizing the Declaration of the Rights of Man And he writes at one place in his reflections on the French Revolution, there's no such thing as the rights of man, there's only the rights of the Englishman, by which he means there's only the rights of someone that belongs to a nation. So the Zionist movement saw the nation state as the major protector of Jews. At the same time, or just a bit later, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights understands the protection against racism not through the kind of nation difference, but through the creation of a universal subject that has equal rights and the protection of those equal rights. Okay, so there's two different conceptions on how to protect the subject, in this case from anti-Semitism, but it doesn't have to be from anti-Semitism. Now, what we see and what I've pointed to is that the nation state that protects the Jew also creates a racial form of racial governance where it puts the Jew on the top and the others, in this case, the Palestinians, on the bottom. So it reflects a certain kind of racial discrimination, racial governance, and in the end, of course, racial violence against the other. So that which is supposed to protect the Jew does it through a mechanism that exerts violence on other racial groups. And therefore, it is a distorted form of protection because it protects one group as it oppresses and eliminates ultimately another. And so that is, I don't know if that's what the person asked, but that is where that connection is carried out. Now, I'm not sure that the resolution is necessarily to go to human rights. That's a different issue, but it's clear to me that the idea that the nation state will protect the Jews is not a good idea, because that mirrors some of the forms of racial governance that it came out against. And that is very important. Maybe I'll stop there.
The relation between anti-Semitism, the traditional anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia is what comes to my mind when you're trying to explain what you're explaining here, and we're trying to grasp the place of the state defending human rights and the people and emancipation inside other given states, right? So. Do you see Islamophobia today as very much part of the same system and with the same root cause as anti-Semitism? Would you go as far as comparing both, stating similarities in the way they operate? A traditional anti-Semitism, of course.
I'm not a scholar of Islamophobia, and I haven't been following it as closely as I should have. But I can say, I think very clearly, that Islamophobia, particularly after the war on terrorism, it is again alive and kicking. And what I've been seeing is that the kind of racism that exists, for example, in the UK, I mean, the racism that I see against Blacks and against Muslims is much more prevalent than the racism against Jews. And yet the topic that is continuously discussed is the racism against Jews. And that has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with, and I have to say, let me just put in brackets a minute, that racism operates, anti-Semitism operates differently in the US and differently in the UK and differently in Brazil and differently in every context, exactly like racism towards Black, because in each country it has its own history, it has a very different histories and relations. So racism against Blacks, where there's the history of slavery, is very different against racism against Blacks in the UK and racism against Black in Brazil. And the same thing has to do with Jews. The Jews in many countries are not at the bottom of the social hierarchy in any way in those countries. But in the UK, they're a very, very small minority, while in the US, they're a larger minority with more power than they are in the UK, and it operates differently. Okay? And so, and Islamophobia, I can imagine, even though I'm not an Islamophobia scholar, that it operates differently in the US and in the UK and in Brazil and everywhere. But the important thing is, an important question we need to ask ourselves is, why is anti-Semitism gaining so much coverage while Islamophobia and anti-Black racism and often sexism and different kinds of isms are not gaining so much traction? And I think, it's a complex, there's a lot to say about this, but I do think that it does tell us a bit about where Muslims are situated in our societies as compared to where Jews are situated in our societies, etc., etc. And so, in reality, if we look what's happening on the ground and what people are experiencing, it's clear to me that people of color and Muslim are experiencing more forms of and more discrimination than Jews.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
so
we see this through the silencing of Palestine, because a lot of the silencing of Palestine that I've been discussing is also Islamophobic, because the targets are Muslim. A lot of them are also Muslim. Okay? So there's an Islam. So anti-Semitism can become a form of Islamophobia. Okay? So the struggle against anti-Semitism can become a form of Islamophobia. Anti-Semitism in the new sense of the term.
Right. Anti-Semitism as in the new definition. Okay.
As
so
in the conflation with Israel. That's when anti-Semitism, the struggle against anti-Semitism, easily morphs into an Islamophobic struggle.
Right. So that, I believe, does answer also Andre Lopes' question. Yeah. We are reaching now a bit more than just over 1 hour, and I don't want to tire you too much. I'd like to know if my colleagues here, Felipe, Paulo, and Artur, have more questions.
I could make one commentary. So thank you, Professor Neve Gordon, for your contribution. Just have a commentary and then just a brief question. So in terms of, I would say that in terms of the nation-state ideology, might have been successful in the creation of Israeli state, in this idea of 19th century of creating this emotional bond, as you have said, between the individual and the collective state. So, and to a certain extent, I think you present a criticism also on the idea, on the broad idea of nation state as a state, as a state that is a collective representative of all individuals. So, but I think that you criticize also as you said, that the creation, the nation state ideology in the creation of the Israeli state did not encompass also the ideology of democratic state of 20th century. So I think it's really interesting when you develop this idea. So it's only a commentary that's saying on criticizing the ideology of nation state and as a tool to identify individuals on the state, and also the lack of democratic standards in the ideology. So I think it's really interesting, this thing. But the only thing I would like to ask is, because I'd like to understand a little bit more your argument about the right to difference. So I try to understand the three arguments that you raised, but the right to difference and the sense of the French new right, I could not understand properly all the idea. So if you could make in a simple words, once again, this part of your presentation. Sorry for asking you to repeat that. It's only because I didn't get out the argument.
So the human rights, the subject of human rights is a universal subject, is the human. And as human, as being a human, regardless of your membership in anything, regardless of anything, as this kind of abstractness, you deserve a whole series, an inventory of rights, right? That we all know. It is against this idea that the French right was writing and claiming that this idea erases difference. And difference in society is important, and we need to protect it. So the whole notion that is very now, and has been for, I don't know, 15, 20 years, very popular, the identity politics, is about protecting certain differences, right? That I have a certain identity that needs to be protected. It can be my language, it can be my culture, it can be certain traditions, it can be a lot of things, my relationship to the land, my indigenousness. There's a certain difference that needs to be protected. That's what identity politics says. Now, the French right came and said that this universality through the erasure of difference is a form of racism too, because it does not acknowledge the specificities of your culture or whatever. Now, both, I have a lot of, one of my books is called The Human Right to Dominate. I have a lot of criticism about human rights. I'm not, but my criticism of the right to difference here was the idea of taking this right and extrapolating also to the state, which is what is done here. So it's not the right of me as a Jew to have my religion and my tradition and my language, me as an Israeli Jew, but a right of the state. Now, I can enjoy my religion, my language without the state today, right? I don't need, and they want to protect the state, and they're protecting a state, they're using it to protect the state that denies or the right to difference of another people, that denies the basic rights. So that was basically the thing. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Neve Gordon. Thank you.
Right.
Philippe wants a question.
Yeah. No, not a question at all. I just like to make a short comment that it's quite interesting to note that at the same time that the nowadays government in Israel is commenting about, if you attack, if you say that what's going on in Palestine or in Gaza actually is a genocide, you are anti-Semitic or you are against the Israeli state. And it's quite remarkable if we note that almost the same argument is in course in Rwanda. When you criticize the government, then the government says that you are a genocide denial. Therefore, the government is above all rules and above every kind of comment or anything in the world. It's quite interesting because both countries are they put themselves in a place where you cannot argue with them. You cannot point your finger on the misleadings of their politics. They put themselves in a place where if you are not okay with their politics, you are denial, you are genocide denial, or you are anti-Semitic, and therefore, so that's the only thing I would like to add to comment. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, ideas travel and from one place to another, and they are appropriated from one government to another. And in a way, what I said is the third attraction of the IHRA is that something not the same definition, but that some parts of it are attractive to other countries because they can be adopted and appropriated for something totally different that is unrelated to anti-Semitism, but is related to forms of racial governance. What I think unites these things is forms of racial governance.
Right. So I do think we should wrap it up here. Also, it's quite late. I mean, Neve is in the UK. He's not here in Brazil, so it's a lot later than it is here for us. It's been a fantastic presentation to think about all this. Definitely, Neve, you did, show how the definition works, how it operates, the kind of ideas and links it creates. How it enforces itself, and how this is all linked to the idea of the Holocaust as a genocide that should never be repeated, which is at the basis of all this. Never again should a people be subjected to genocide, right? That's the basic idea that is behind the whole the whole argument. I mean, how does the IHRA gain people's how does it manage to be adopted by so many countries and people and so on?
But even that never again, as we know, is racialized. First of all, as your group knows, it emerges only when genocidal crimes are carried out on European soil. The same countries carried out genocidal crimes in Namibia, what is Namibia today. And no one really, there was no never again. And we see how that racialization continues and continues, and who is the, and even in the Gaza Strip with the 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen that were killed, and there was an international uproar. But we have to remind the viewers that an aid worker had been killed on average every single day for 191 days before they were. And no one gave a shit. Excuse my French. Okay? And so what we want to do, I think, is to kind of disconnect this never again that you're talking about with racism, and that it's never again for everyone.
Right. So I think this is what this forum is all about, Neve. So thank you very much. I'd like to know if Professor Paulo or anyone wants to say some final words.
Well, if I may just thank you again, Professor Neve Gordon, for your presentation. And I can confess to you that you have comforted me in discussions with another colleague when I said that I clearly felt myself as anti-Zionist, but not at all as an anti-Semite. And the answer was that this is the beginning of an anti-Semite is to be an anti-Zionist. You drew the difference very clearly, and I am personally thankful for you to you for that.
So thank you guys, because as I said, I've never talked to an audience in Brazil, and I want to one day come to Brazil. I've had many students from Brazil. And yeah, hopefully in the coming years, we'll meet face to face and break bread together.
Yes, hopefully, yes, definitely. It would be lovely to have, a semester of course or whatever, joint course in São Paulo at the São Paulo University. Let's hope we can work on that idea.
Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.